A 30-foot fall in 1962 shattered Mario Wallenda's spine, but the circus machine had already hijacked his mind. Brainwashed to believe he had zero value off the high wire, the paralyzed performer strapped himself into a custom Sky-Cycle to risk his life all over again. He gambled his survival in a wheelchair because the industry convinced him a grounded life was worthless. This is the unvarnished truth of how a performer was psychologically trapped by the spotlight. Consider the visual evidence of Mario Wallenda's later life. Decades after a catastrophic collapse in 1962 that severed his spinal cord and left him permanently paralyzed from the waist down, he returned to the high wire. He did not return walking, but suspended in a custom-built, heavily modified wheelchair contraption known as the Circus. It was a heavy, cumbersome machine requiring immense upper body strength to navigate across a steel cable suspended high above the ground. The audiences who witnessed this spectacle wept. They stood and cheered for a man who refused to let a wheelchair dictate his boundaries. They saw a hero defying the odds. But beneath the applause lies a profoundly disturbing reality. This was not a triumphant individual exercising free will. This was the remnant of a biological machine reverting to its original programming. Mario Wallenda's return to the wire forces an uncomfortable examination of an industry that extracts every functioning mechanism from a body until the skeletal structure gives way, and then, rather than offering sanctuary, demands that the shattered pieces be reassembled to generate further revenue. In this specific sector of the entertainment industry, the flesh of the performer is not merely a vessel for art, it is a depreciating financial asset. The business model relies entirely on the conversion of human physical risk into ticket sales. The performers are subjected to an environment where their bodies are systematically turned into tools for making a living. The awe they inspire in the audience is directly proportional to the anatomical damage they are willing to endure. The fundamental tragedy of the circus artist is that their identity is completely consumed by their physical capability. When the body inevitably begins to fail under the strain, the identity of the individual collapses alongside it. Mario Wallenda was not born into this machine, he was assimilated into it. Adopted by Carl Wallenda, the formidable patriarch of the Flying Wallendas, Mario's integration into the family was dictated by utility rather than conventional paternal affection. In the architecture of the Wallenda enterprise, children were not dependents to be sheltered. They were raw materials waiting to be processed into load-bearing components. From the moment he possessed the basic motor skills to follow instruction, Mario's trajectory was permanently altered. The standard developmental milestones of childhood were systematically erased. By the age of 14, his formal education was permanently terminated. He was removed from the classroom not out of necessity, but because his physical dimensions made him suitable for a highly specific, dangerous function within the family's primary revenue stream. He was drafted to become the foundational anchor for the troupe's signature spectacle, the 7-person chair pyramid. The biomechanical reality of acting as the anchor in a multi-tiered human structure on a high wire is brutally exacting. A 14-year-old human body is in a critical phase of musculoskeletal development. The epiphyseal plates or growth plates at the ends of the long bones are still open and vulnerable. The spinal column is still maturing, yet Mario was placed at the very bottom of the pyramid. The physics of this position dictate that the combined shifting gravitational force of the adult performers balancing above him, along with the heavy balancing poles they carried, transferred directly downward through his adolescent frame. This was not a singular feat of strength performed once, but a repetitive daily erosion of his structural integrity. The audience, gazing upwards, saw only the illusion of weightlessness, a flawless geometric shape suspended against the canvas of the circus tent. They saw the serene expressions and the glittering costumes that caught the spotlight. What they did not see was the severe mechanical stress occurring beneath the fabric. They did not witness the intense compression of the intervertebral discs in Mario's lumbar spine, forced to absorb shock loads they were never evolved to handle. They could not hear the fraying of the menisci in his knee joints, acting as inadequate buffers against the immense downward pressure. The reality of his existence was a continuous accumulation of microtraumas. Muscle fascia stretched to tearing points, collateral ligaments maintaining unnatural tension, and joint cartilage slowly grinding away. The visual contrast was absolute and grotesque. Above him was the fabricated beauty of the performance. Within his own body was the silent, accelerated deterioration of his physical health. However, in the Wallenda system, physical pain was not acknowledged as a biological warning sign that the body was sustaining damage. Pain was framed as an obstacle to be mentally bypassed. The body was simply a tool, and the utility of the tool superseded its maintenance. Aching joints were silenced, inflammation was ignored, and the structural damage was concealed behind the mandatory performance smile. This physical exploitation was enforced by a rigid, psychological framework designed to override basic human survival instincts. Carl Wallenda operated the troupe under a strict doctrine of absolute discipline, a system that effectively equated performance with breathing. To survive the daily agonizing pressure placed upon his young body, Mario had to be conditioned to detach from his own physical distress. He was subjected to a form of psychological conditioning that taught him his body did not belong to him. His physical form belonged entirely to the family name, to the contracts that bound them, and to the spectators who paid to witness their proximity to death. The concept of a sick day or a period of physical recovery does not exist for the anchor of a 7-person pyramid. If the anchor falters, the entire structure falls, and the family's livelihood is destroyed. Therefore, Mario was instilled with a toxic, pathological sense of responsibility. He learned to silence his own biology because the system demanded complete, unquestioning submission. When a tendon strained, he stepped onto the wire. When his spine ached with compounding pressure, he bore the weight. The nightly applause served as a powerful reinforcing mechanism, a temporary dopamine reward that the system used to justify the permanent anatomical cost being extracted from him. He was taught that his value as a human being existed only in the space between the platforms. Off the wire, he was nobody. On the wire, bearing the crushing weight of his family's legacy, he was essential. This was not a demonstration of resilience, it was the systematic dismantling of a boy's autonomy, replacing his right to a healthy life with a devastating obligation to perform, no matter how profoundly his body was breaking apart. A high wire is typically a steel cable measuring a mere 5/8 of an inch in diameter. It is strung under immense tension, creating a volatile surface that constantly vibrates, sways, and reacts to every shift in air currents and temperature. To stand on this wire is to engage in a continuous microscopic battle against gravity. To place a 7-person human pyramid upon it is an act of calculated anatomical defiance. The public views the pyramid as a static, beautiful geometric formation. In reality, it is a structure vibrating with immense suppressed kinetic energy, and all of that destructive force must eventually travel downward into the bodies forming the foundation. The foundation consists of 4 men walking directly on the wire, yoked together by steel shoulder bars. Upon these bars stand 2 more men, also yoked by a shoulder bar. At the absolute apex, balancing upon a chair resting on that second-tier bar, sits a single performer. Furthermore, each man carries a balancing pole crafted from solid steel or heavy wood, weighing anywhere from 30 to 45 pounds. When you calculate the combined mass of the performers, the rigging, and the balancing poles, the total weight easily exceeds 1,000 pounds. This massive top-heavy load is concentrated entirely upon the few square inches of leather-clad human feet making contact with the wire. As an anchor at the base of this pyramid, Mario Wallenda was the human equivalent of a load-bearing concrete pillar. However, a concrete pillar is static. It is designed to withstand compressive forces. The human musculoskeletal system is dynamic, designed for mobility and flexibility. Forcing a human spine to act as an unyielding strut for a fluctuating 1,000-pound load is an invitation to physiological ruin. The physics of the pyramid dictate that any slight imbalance, a gust of wind, or a microscopic shift in weight from the performers at the apex does not dissipate into the air. That kinetic energy travels down the structure, magnifying in force until it crashes directly into the shoulders and spines of the base anchors. Mario was forced to absorb these violent, invisible shock waves while simultaneously maintaining absolute forward momentum and perfect equilibrium. The medical reality of this daily requirement is horrifying. The human spinal column naturally curves in an S shape to absorb the shock of standard walking or running. Under the extreme, sustained axial loading of the 7-person pyramid, Mario's spine was essentially compressed into a rigid, unnatural alignment. The intervertebral discs, the fluid-filled sacs that cushion the vertebrae, were subjected to forces that squeezed their nucleus pulposus outward. Over time, this relentless compression prevents the discs from rehydrating during periods of rest. They flatten, lose their elasticity, and begin to bulge. As the cushioning degrades, the vertebrae inch closer together. The body, desperately attempting to stabilize this unnatural joint friction, begins to calcify the surrounding ligaments and grow osteophytes, or bone spurs. These jagged, newly formed bony projections inevitably begin to scrape against the highly sensitive nerve roots branching out from the spinal cord, creating chronic, radiating pain that no amount of adrenaline can completely mask. The destruction extended far beyond the spine. The steel shoulder bars connecting the anchors did not rest gently upon the skin. They dug aggressively into the trapezius muscles and the clavicle bones under the weight of the tiers above. This constant heavy pressure severely restricted local vascular circulation, causing localized ischemia, a restriction in blood supply that deprives the muscle tissue of oxygen and glucose. Without adequate oxygen, the muscles switch to anaerobic metabolism, rapidly flooding the tissue with lactic acid. The muscles become rigid, burning intensely as the pH levels drop. Yet Mario was required to keep those muscles perfectly stable. The repeated trauma of the heavy bar grinding against the flesh caused deep tissue microhemorrhages. Blood pooled beneath the surface, creating deep, dark hematomas that were never afforded the physiological time required to heal. The damaged tissue would begin to repair itself during the night, only to be violently torn open again during the next day's performance. Down at the point of contact, the structural integrity of the feet was systematically compromised. The performers wore thin, flexible leather slippers with soles fashioned from elk hide. This footwear provided traction, but zero shock absorption. The convex curve of the tightly strung steel cable pushed aggressively upward into the arch of the foot with every agonizing step. This upward pressure placed immense, unnatural strain on the plantar fascia, the thick band of tissue running across the bottom of the foot. The continuous necessity to grip the wire with the toes, combined with the crushing downward force of the pyramid, led to the gradual breakdown of the metatarsal joints. The feet, the only point of connection between life and a fatal plunge, were reduced to bruised, swollen appendages, often plagued by stress fractures and severe inflammatory conditions. This is where the stark, grotesque contrast of the circus industry is most evident. The audience in the arena is intentionally blinded to this physical horror. They are captivated by the sweeping beams of the spotlights, the glittering sequins of the costumes, and the triumphant, swelling cadence of the brass band. They see the performers raise their free hands in a gesture of effortless victory. What they cannot perceive is the raw, visceral reality occurring just beneath the fabric. They cannot hear the sickening percussive clicks of damaged cartilage grinding inside the knee joints. They cannot see the involuntary tremors of overtaxed muscle fibers threatening to go into full spasm. They are completely unaware of the cold sweat of pure, agonizing physical exertion, or the silent, desperate counting of steps as the body begs for the release of the final platform. The illusion of grace is maintained entirely by the absolute suppression of biological distress. The true cruelty of this existence was not just the act itself, but the aftermath. When the performance concluded and the performers descended from the wire, the adrenaline that had temporarily masked the worst of the pain began to metabolize and fade. Inside the stark, unglamorous confines of the dressing rooms, the biological reality set in. The body, having been pushed past its structural limits, triggered a massive inflammatory response. Joints swelled tightly, muscles locked in severe cramps, and the nervous system fired relentless pain signals from the compressed spinal roots and bruised flesh. Yet, the circus schedule is a machine that does not pause for physiological recovery. There were no weeks off for rehabilitation, there were only hours. Ice packs, tight bandages, and a heavy reliance on chemical painkillers became the standard regimen just to achieve a basic level of mobility the following morning. Mario Wallenda woke up every day inside a body that was actively degrading, stiffened by the scar tissue of thousands of unhealed micro tears. The very act of standing up from a bed required a conscious, painful effort to force locked joints back into motion. He was an anchor, a foundational piece of equipment in a highly lucrative family enterprise. But unlike a steel strut that can be replaced when it shows signs of metal fatigue, the human anchor is bound by flesh and blood. His body was flashing every possible physiological warning sign, signaling that catastrophic structural failure was imminent. But the system he existed within, the system that defined his entire worth, possessed no mechanism for stopping. The machinery of the show demanded that the broken components simply be heavily medicated, taped together, and forced back onto the wire. The absence of a safety net in the Wallenda Act was historically marketed to the public as the ultimate display of artistic purity and unparalleled bravery. Karl Wallenda, the architect of this doctrine, frequently claimed to the press that a net fostered a false sense of security, leading to complacency and microscopic errors in judgment. However, when subjected to psychological and occupational scrutiny, this no-net policy reveals itself not as a badge of honor, but as a calculated draconian mechanism of absolute control. It was the ultimate psychological tether designed to manipulate the deepest, most primal survival instincts of the performers. In any standard industrial environment, safety equipment is designed to protect the worker from the inherent risks of the labor. In the Wallenda enterprise, the deliberate removal of safety equipment was a feature of the labor itself. By stripping away the net, Karl Wallenda effectively stripped his family members, including Mario, of the physiological luxury of an exit strategy. When a net is present, the human brain registers a margin for error. A fall is an accident, but it is not a definitive end. By removing that net, the environment is transformed into a binary system of flawless execution or immediate catastrophic trauma. This environment forces the brain into a state of continuous hypervigilant terror. The performer is no longer operating out of passion or artistic expression. They are operating out of a hijacked limbic system, desperately trying to postpone their own execution. For Mario, conditioned since childhood within this closed system, the absence of a net was normalized as the standard operating procedure of his existence. He was systematically programmed to view the concrete floor 32 feet below not as a lethal threat, but as an irrelevant void that simply did not exist so long as the routine was maintained. The doctrine of no net forced Mario to internalize a horrifying operational parameter. His life was not inherently valuable. It only possessed value if he maintained his grip, held his balance, and supported the weight of the family above him. This is the apex of workplace abuse disguised as tradition. It weaponized a child's trust and a young man's loyalty, turning their own bodies into hostages to the family brand. This fragile, abusive architecture of flesh and physics was destined to reach its mathematical breaking point. The human body, no matter how rigorously conditioned or psychologically terrorized, cannot permanently suspend the laws of gravity and biomechanical fatigue. That breaking point arrived on the evening of January 30th, 1962, at the State Fair Coliseum in Detroit, Michigan. The Shrine Circus had drawn a massive crowd, eager to witness the morbid thrill of the 7-person pyramid. The environment was clinically unforgiving. The wire was strung 32 feet in the air. Beneath it, there was no sawdust, no rubberized matting, and no safety net. There was only the unyielding expanse of polished concrete. As the pyramid formed and began its agonizingly slow traversal across the steel cable, Mario Wallenda took his position as an anchor at the rear base. Above him, the heavy steel shoulder bars dug into his already traumatized trapezius muscles. The combined weight of his family members compressed down his spinal column, pushing his vertebrae to their absolute structural limits. Every step required the precise, synchronized firing of thousands of muscle fibers, battling the shifting kinetic energy of the 1,000-pound, top-heavy human structure. The margin for error was non-existent. The wire vibrated under the immense tension, a live, hostile surface demanding total biological subjugation. The catalyst for the collapse did not originate from a failure in Mario's strength, but from the inherent instability of the system itself. At the front of the wire, Dieter Schepp, Mario's nephew, was making his debut as the lead man. Under the crushing psychological pressure and the physical strain, Schepp's grip on his 35-pound balancing pole began to falter. In the meticulously balanced ecosystem of the pyramid, the balancing pole is not an accessory, it is a vital counterweight. When Schepp's hand slipped and the heavy pole dipped downward, the center of gravity of the entire 7-person structure shifted violently and irreversibly off the vertical axis. In a static architectural structure, a shifting load might cause a crack or a localized fracture. In the dynamic high-wire pyramid, a shifting load dictates immediate, total systemic failure. As Schepp struggled to regain control, the kinetic energy transferred backward through the steel shoulder bars, violently twisting the posture of the men behind him. Mario, locked into his position by the yoke across his shoulders, felt the sudden, terrifying torque. The human anchors desperately attempted to counterlean, their bodies fighting against a sudden influx of angular momentum that their muscles simply could not counteract. The collapse was not a graceful descent. It was a violent mechanical disintegration. The pyramid shattered. The performers lost their connection to the wire and to each other, transitioning instantly from a synchronized unit into isolated, free-falling objects. The physics of the event were absolute and merciless. Falling from a height of 32 feet, the human body reaches the concrete in approximately 1.4 seconds. In that brief, silent window of freefall, all psychological conditioning, all familial loyalty, and all the years of brutal physical training were rendered completely irrelevant. Gravity reclaimed the bodies that had defied it for so long. The impact upon the concrete floor was a masterclass in catastrophic anatomical trauma. The human skeletal system is incapable of absorbing the kinetic energy generated by a 32-foot drop. When Mario Wallenda struck the ground, the deceleration was instantaneous. The sheer force of the impact traveled upward through his skeletal structure, seeking the points of least resistance. Dieter Schepp and Richard Faunin suffered massive, fatal, blunt force trauma, their lives extinguished upon impact. For Mario, the trauma was concentrated in a devastating biomechanical failure. As his body violently halted against the concrete, the extreme compressive forces shattered the vertebrae in his lower thoracic spine. The bone did not merely break, it burst under the pressure. Jagged shards of fractured vertebrae were driven backward by the force of the impact. The impact was catastrophic. The extreme compressive force shattered the vertebrae in his lower thoracic spine, severely damaging the spinal cord. In a fraction of a second, the neurological connection to the lower half of his body was permanently severed, altering the trajectory of his life forever. The intricate network of nerves, muscles, and joints that had been meticulously trained, exploited, and weaponized by the circus machine was suddenly rendered inert. Blood rapidly pooled in the spinal canal, initiating a cascade of cellular death in the surrounding nervous tissue. He suffered a severe skull fracture, plunging him into a coma, his brain swelling violently against the confines of his cranium. The arena, seconds prior, filled with the expectant silence of a captive audience, erupted into chaos and screams. The spectators had come to witness a brush with death, but they were entirely unprepared for the visceral, blood-soaked reality of the consequence. They witnessed the ultimate price of their entertainment: bodies broken, lives ended, and a young man's physical autonomy violently revoked. At 21 years old, Mario Wallenda's existence as a load-bearing tool for his family was abruptly terminated. The machine had finally pushed the material past its breaking point. He lay on the concrete, hovering between life and death, entirely unaware that the lower half of his body would never respond to his commands again. The illusion of the high wire was shattered, replaced by the grim clinical reality of paraplegia. Yet the most disturbing aspect of this tragedy was not the fall itself, but the horrific reality that the circus machine, driven by the ruthless ideology of Karl Wallenda, had no intention of letting the broken anchor rest. The transition from the deafening, chaotic echo of the Detroit State Fair Coliseum to the sterile, heavily monitored environment of the intensive care unit marked a fundamental and irreversible division in Mario Wallenda's existence. When the initial swelling in his cranium subsided and the medically induced fog began to clear, the clinical reality of his condition was presented to him not as a temporary setback, but as a permanent architectural redesign of his anatomy. The diagnosis was complete paraplegia. The violent impact with the concrete floor had not simply bruised his spinal cord, it had systematically crushed the lower thoracic vertebrae, effectively severing the critical neurological pathways that communicated with the lower half of his body. From the chest down, Mario was rendered entirely inert. The intricate, heavily conditioned musculature of his legs, the very tools that had allowed him to grip the 5/8-inch steel cable and act as the foundational anchor for his family, would rapidly begin to atrophy. His body, which had previously been a highly calibrated instrument of precision and strength, was now biologically bisected. The upper half remained entirely functional, while the lower half had been transformed into permanent, unyielding, dead weight. In a standard societal framework, a catastrophic industrial accident resulting in permanent paralysis marks the definitive end of a physical laborer's career. It initiates a period of profound grief, extensive medical rehabilitation, and a necessary psychological pivot toward a new, accessible mode of living. However, the Wallenda enterprise did not operate within standard societal or ethical parameters. It functioned as an insular, self-sustaining microeconomy where the only recognized currency was physical spectacle. The machine had suffered a systemic failure, resulting in the deaths of Dieter Schepp and Richard Fallnen and the permanent disabling of Mario. Yet the reaction of the system, governed by the patriarch Karl Wallenda, was entirely devoid of standard human mourning or operational pause. The ideology of the troupe demanded that tragedy be immediately metabolized into logistical recalibration. The surviving members performed the very next night. The underlying message was brutally clear. The human components of the act were entirely replaceable. and the machinery of the circus would not halt for the dead or the broken. It is within this immediate traumatic aftermath that the true predatory nature of the Wallenda psychological conditioning becomes evident. Mario Wallenda was confined to a hospital bed, grappling with the catastrophic loss of his physical autonomy and the horrifying phantom pains of a severed nervous system. He was a man who knew his body was irreversibly damaged, yet he was entirely unequipped to process a life outside the confines of the circus tent. The tragedy was not isolated to the acute physical agony of his shattered spine. The deeper, more insidious tragedy was the ingrained obligation to step back onto the stage, despite that devastating pain. Since he was 14 years old, his entire cognitive framework had been programmed to equate his breathing existence with his utility on the wire. He possessed no formal education, no alternative vocational skills, and no social identity disconnected from his surname. He was an artist who had lived entirely through the extreme physical capability of his own flesh. Without the ability to perform, the terrifying question emerged. If he could no longer act as the anchor, did he have any fundamental right to exist? Carl Wallenda understood this psychological vulnerability intimately because he was the architect who had built it. Rather than offering his adopted son a pathway out of the industry that had just crippled him, Carl approached the paralyzed young man with a proposition that bordered on the grotesque. He did not suggest retirement, he suggested adaptation. Carl proposed that Mario return to the high wire, not walking but seated in a specially rigged wheelchair. He even enthusiastically pitched a routine where he, the patriarch, would perform a handstand upon Mario's shoulders, while Mario balanced the wheelchair on the cable. This was the absolute apex of the circus machine's exploitative capability. It was a cold, calculated decision to recommodify a broken asset. Carl recognized that the public's appetite for danger would be exponentially amplified by the introduction of severe physical disability. The audience would no longer just be paying to see a balancing act. They would be paying to consume the raw, visceral trauma of a paralyzed man defying his own ruined anatomy. The system was actively seeking to recycle Mario's physical devastation into a highly lucrative, emotionally manipulative narrative of resurrection. The biomechanical and medical implications of this proposition were staggering. Balancing on a high wire is not solely achieved through the arms or the inner ear. It requires the continuous, microscopic firing of core stabilizing muscles and the crucial proprioceptive feedback from the feet gripping the cable. Paraplegia eliminates all of this. A person with a severed thoracic spine possesses no active abdominal control to stabilize their torso. They cannot feel shifts in weight beneath their waist. To place a paralyzed individual in a heavy steel wheelchair and suspend them on a vibrating cable is to demand that their upper body, their arms, shoulders, and neck compensate for the total loss of their lower skeletal structure. It is an invitation to severe secondary biomechanical ruin. The physical strain required to manipulate the wheels, maintain perfect equilibrium without core muscles, and absorb the vibrations of the wire would inevitably inflict catastrophic damage upon his shoulders and cervical spine. He would be forced to maintain the illusion of a flawless performance by enduring an entirely new spectrum of physical torture. Yet, the most horrifying aspect of Carl Wallenda's proposition was that Mario did not possess the psychological capacity to refuse it. This is the definition of the illusion of choice. When a human being is raised in an environment where their sole metric for love, acceptance, and survival is their willingness to endure physical punishment for the family business, they do not possess true agency. The relentless discipline of the high wire had trapped him in a state of learned helplessness. Mario Wallenda agreed to the concept of the Wheelchair Act not out of a triumphant desire to conquer his disability, but out of a desperate pathological need to remain useful to the machine that had broken him. He was trapped in a cycle where the audience, the contracts, and the family name exerted a controlling force so absolute that it overrode his basic biological instinct for self-preservation. The world outside the circus was a terrifying, incomprehensible void. The wire, despite having shattered his spine and stolen his mobility, was the only environment where the rules made sense to his conditioned mind. He knew the body was fundamentally failing him, yet the psychological programming compelled him to ignore the warnings and prepare to perform anyway. He was preparing to lock his paralyzed, unfeeling legs into a steel contraption, fully aware that the system cared nothing for his healing, only for his continued capacity to generate awe and revenue. The resilience that the public would soon applaud was, in reality, the grim mechanical compliance of a tool that had been reshaped but refused permission to retire. For decades following the catastrophic collapse in Detroit, Mario Wallenda's life superficially resembled a successful, albeit forced, assimilation into conventional society. He secured employment outside the insular economy of the circus, spending 38 years working a stable job at a manufacturing plant. To the untrained external observer, this trajectory represents a triumph of rehabilitation. A paralyzed man finding a way to contribute to the workforce and maintain a semblance of domestic normalcy. However, when viewed through the lens of psychological conditioning, those 38 years were not a period of healing. They were a prolonged state of sensory deprivation and profound identity crisis. The factory floor offered safety, routine, and a complete absence of mortal danger. Yet, for a brain that had been systematically rewired since the age of 14 to equate the proximity of death with personal value, this safety was intolerable. Mario did not possess the cognitive framework to derive satisfaction from a mundane existence. In the Wallenda psychological architecture, if you were not actively risking your biological integrity for the spectacle, you were essentially invisible. This deep-seated neurological addiction to extreme utility eventually manifested in the creation of a machine that defied both mechanical logic and self-preservation. It was dubbed the Psycho-Cycle. Mario, despite his advancing age and the permanent paralysis of his lower extremities, became consumed by the compulsion to return to the high wire. He could not walk, so he engineered a vehicle to drag his broken body back into the sky. The Psycho-Cycle was not a lightweight, aerodynamic piece of performance equipment. It was a massive, heavily modified, dual-wheeled steel contraption weighing in excess of 150 kilograms. To place a machine of this density carrying the dead weight of a paralyzed adult male onto a vibrating 5/8-inch steel cable is to invite catastrophic structural failure. The biomechanics of operating this machine were horrifying. Because Mario possessed no active core musculature to stabilize his torso and no leg function to adjust his center of gravity, the entire burden of balancing this 150-kilogram steel pendulum fell upon his upper body. Every microscopic shift in the wire required his aging shoulders, rotator cuffs, and cervical spine to absorb and counteract violent kinetic forces. The physical exertion required merely to keep the Sky-Cycle upright on the cable was enough to tear the cartilage in a healthy athlete's shoulders. For a man whose body had already endured decades of extreme trauma, it was an act of accelerated physical self-destruction. The machine did not liberate him from his wheelchair. It weaponized his disability, transforming his paralysis into a heavier, more dangerous spectacle. When Mario Wallenda survived the Detroit collapse that killed his nephew and brother-in-law, he didn't just inherit paraplegia, he inherited a crushing, suffocating case of survivor's guilt. In the twisted psychology of the Wallenda family, surviving a catastrophic fall was almost viewed as a failure of commitment. You were supposed to die for the act. Mario lived, and the circus promoters, acting as the ultimate apex predators, weaponized that guilt flawlessly. They understood a grim sociological truth. The general public is fascinated by tragedy, but they are absolutely addicted to the illusion of overcoming it. When Mario returned to the wire on the Sky-Cycle, the promoters didn't sell tickets to a display of acrobatic skill. They sold tickets to a psychological freak show. They marketed him not as an athlete, but as a martyr. Every time he rolled that 150-kilogram wheelchair onto the cable, the audience below wasn't cheering for his balance. They were cheering for his trauma. They were purchasing the macabre thrill of watching a broken man dangle above the abyss, effectively paying him to publicly perform his own PTSD. This created a horrifying neurological feedback loop. Mario, stripped of his ability to walk and desperate to justify why he had survived the concrete floor in Detroit while his family members had died, found his absolution in the applause. The promoters convinced him that the only way to honor the dead was to continue risking his own life in the exact same manner. If he stayed on the ground, he was just a paralyzed man, a victim. But if he got in the Sky-Cycle and triggered the audience's morbid pity, he was a Wallenda. The industry actively incentivized his trauma, essentially holding his psychological closure hostage. They built an economy entirely reliant on his suffering, forcing him to monetize his own paralysis just to buy a temporary reprieve from the crushing guilt of surviving. The starkest indictment of this endeavor did not come from medical professionals, but from the raw, desperate grief of his wife, Linda. She represented the unconditioned, rational world observing the pathology of the circus from the inside. Linda did not view the Sky-Cycle as an inspirational tool of resilience. She recognized it as an instrument of slow execution. She was forced to watch her husband pour his remaining physical strength into engineering his own potential demise. In a moment of devastating clarity, Linda wept openly, her frustration directed not just at Mario, but at the parasitic nature of the circus environment that continued to enable him. She stated with harrowing accuracy, "They don't care if he gets killed doing this." She recognized that the system surrounding him, the promoters, the audiences, and the lingering phantom of the family doctrine, viewed his potential death not as a tragedy to be prevented, but as the ultimate, highly marketable climax to his act. When confronted by his family and wife regarding the sheer lunacy of the Sky-Cycle, Mario adamantly denied having any suicidal tendencies. From a clinical perspective, his denial was likely genuine. He was not actively seeking to end his life. The tragedy was far more complex. He was suffering from the ultimate terminal stage of toxic productivity. He did not want to die. He simply did not know how to exist as a human being if he was not on the wire. The applause of the crowd was not a superficial desire. It was the only auditory confirmation his brain had ever been programmed to accept as proof that his life had meaning. This is the most insidious consequence of the Wallenda conditioning. The discipline did not just break Mario's spine, it systematically destroyed his capacity for inherent self-worth. It stripped away his ability to sit quietly in a room and feel justified in his own existence. He had been brainwashed to such an absolute degree that he voluntarily built a 150-kilogram steel trap, hoisted his paralyzed body into it, and propelled himself back into the lethal void, mistakenly believing he was pursuing a passion. He wasn't chasing a dream. He was fulfilling a devastating psychological dependence. The circus had convinced him that a broken tool still owed them a performance. The final decades of Mario Wallenda's life provide a harrowing clinical portrait of what occurs when a human body reaches the absolute limits of its biological endurance, yet the mind remains fundamentally imprisoned by a terminal psychological conditioning. As he aged into his 60s and 70s, the physiological reality of long-term paraplegia began to exert its inescapable toll. The human body is inherently designed for movement. When half of its mass is rendered permanently immobile, a slow systemic degradation initiates. For Mario, the physical deterioration was not a sudden event, but a grueling, humiliating process of cellular decay. The most immediate and continuous threat came from the severe compromise of his skin integrity. Remaining seated in a wheelchair for decades causes chronic ischemia, a restriction of blood supply, to the tissues compressed beneath the pelvic bones. Without the neurological ability to feel discomfort and instinctively shift his weight, the skin and underlying muscle tissue were routinely starved of oxygen. This resulted in the frequent development of decubitus, ulcers, severe pressure sores, where the tissue essentially becomes necrotic and dies. These were not superficial wounds. They were deep, agonizing cavities that often exposed the underlying bone, creating a constant lethal risk of osteomyelitis and systemic sepsis. His immune system, continuously fighting off these localized infections, was perpetually exhausted. The man who had once been categorized as a superhuman specimen, an anchor who supported 1,000 pounds of shifting weight, was now engaged in a desperate daily battle against his own rotting flesh. This severe physical vulnerability extended disastrously into the mundane tasks of terrestrial life. Stripped of his high-wire environment, Mario was entirely defenseless against the ordinary hazards of the ground. He suffered frequent, violent falls from his wheelchair, his upper body lacking the reflexive speed to protect his head and shoulders as he crashed onto the floor. In one particularly grotesque incident, while attempting to maintain his own property, the riding lawnmower he was operating overturned. Mario was thrown and trapped beneath the heavy machinery. He lay pinned against the earth, entirely unable to free his paralyzed legs as the machine leaked highly flammable gasoline across his body. He narrowly escaped being incinerated alive. These incidents highlight a profound, terrifying irony. Mario Wallenda was statistically closer to a violent death while performing basic yard work than he was while sitting in a 150-kilogram steel contraption suspended above a stadium floor. This jarring juxtaposition explains, in part, the cognitive dissonance that drove his final years. The ground was a place of humiliation, of pressure sores, of helpless accidents, and of a body that refused to obey. The high wire, conversely, was an environment of absolute programmed control. It was the only spatial reality where his traumatic conditioning allowed him to feel a sense of mastery. The final tether connecting Mario to rational existence was severed with the death of his wife, Linda. She had been the singular voice of unconditioned sanity in his life, the woman who had wept in absolute despair as he built the Sky-Cycle, recognizing the suicidal nature of his obsession. When Linda passed away, Mario lost his final anchor to the world outside the circus tent. Without her grief to serve as a mirror reflecting the madness of his actions, his lifelong brainwashing took complete, unchallenged control of his declining cognitive state. In his early 70s, with a body ravaged by ulcers, arthritis, and the compounding trauma of decades of paraplegia, Mario announced his intention to perform a new stunt. He declared that he was developing a mechanism to ride a bicycle in a full 360-degree loop on the high wire. From a biomechanical and engineering standpoint, the proposal was an absolute absurdity. It was an impossibility that defied the laws of physics, let alone the physical capacity of a paralyzed septuagenarian. But the announcement was never about engineering. It was the final tragic symptom of an identity that had been entirely consumed by the circus machine. When questioned about his mortality and his relentless drive to perform, Mario offered a chillingly bleak assessment of his own future, stating, "Where I'm going, the wheelchairs will have square wheels." This was not a statement of hope or resilience. It was the devastating admission of a man who could not conceptualize peace. His conditioning had convinced him that existence was synonymous with struggle, and that even in death he would be subjected to further agonizing resistance. He could not envision an afterlife of rest, only a continuation of the physical labor he had endured since childhood. Mario Wallenda passed away in 2015. He died off the wire, succumbing to the compounding infections and systemic failures of his broken body, carrying the unfulfilled programmed desire for one final performance into the grave. The public narrative surrounding Mario Wallenda has historically been categorized as a triumph of the human spirit. The world watched him drag his paralyzed body across the sky and responded with thunderous applause, validating his struggle and cementing his legacy as a symbol of unyielding perseverance. However, this historical interpretation requires a severe and immediate correction. The audiences who cheered for Mario on the Sky-Cycle were not witnessing a man conquering his destiny. They were applauding the terminal symptoms of a lifelong psychological abuse. They were observing a ghost. The vibrant, autonomous human being that Mario Wallenda could have become was effectively killed on the concrete floor in Detroit at the age of 21. The entity that survived to the age of 73 was a heavily modified biological tool operating on the residual programming of a ruthless system that refused to let him rest. His story serves as a profound and urgent warning for the modern era. We exist in a society that fetishizes productivity and heavily romanticizes the concept of relentless endurance. We are constantly surrounded by corporate systems, professional environments, and even family structures that operate under the same toxic principles as the Wallenda Circus. They demand that we push past our physical and psychological breaking points, masking exploitation under the guise of passion, loyalty, or familial duty. They teach us to ignore the warning signs of our own deteriorating health, both mental and physical, and to measure our inherent worth exclusively by our output and our utility to the machine. The tragedy of Mario Wallenda teaches us that true courage is rarely found in the refusal to surrender. More often, it is found in the terrifying decision to walk away. It takes immense bravery to look at a system that demands your total destruction and refuse to comply. It requires profound strength to recognize when a passion has mutated into a pathology, and when a family legacy has become a lethal burden. When a system insists that you must sacrifice your health, your identity, and your peace to prove your value, the most heroic act you can perform is not to endure it, but to dismantle it. The ultimate takeaway from the life of the paralyzed acrobat is not that we must always keep performing despite our pain. It is the realization that no audience, no contract, and no legacy is worth the permanent destruction of your soul, and that every human being possesses the fundamental, undeniable right to simply stop.